Good afternoon, everybody. I thank you all for coming. Because of the vote, our colleagues may be trickling in. Nearly 1 year ago, Senator Durbin and I worked together, began talking at least about how we could do this criminal justice reform legislation. As the new chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I had begun discussions about the victims' reform agenda. Criminal justice reform was a natural fit on that agenda. Our conversation brought together a unique group of senators who wanted to create a proposal that would address major needs in the country's sentencing and correction system. The result was a historic reform bill that passed the Judiciary Committee 15-5. And while the Sentencing Reform and Correction Act had earned support from a wide variety of senators and organizations, we found out soon that there needed to be some fine-tuning after it left the committee. Over the last several months, we received a lot of positive feedback from our colleagues. We also heard questions and ideas for improvement. We worked together to incorporate those ideas under and make changes to the bill designed to gain additional co-sponsors. We now have 37 co-sponsors. There aren't many comprehensive bills with this magnitude that have earned this type of support. These changes also brought additional support from outside organizations. This includes organizations like the Concerned Veterans of America and the National District Attorneys Association, which happens to be the largest organization of prosecutors in the country. The bill also has the support of hundreds of organizations, including civil rights, conservative, religious, and law enforcement groups. Obviously, reaching a consensus hasn't been easy, but as you can see, we have a remarkable group of senators supporting the bill. We believe it truly addresses, in a bipartisan way, the concerns that have been brought forward. I look forward to the debate on the Senate floor. We'll speak in this order and then take questions. Senator Durbin, my partner in this effort, Senator Cornyn, Senator Leahy, Senator Lee, and then Senator Whitehouse. So we'll proceed in that order, if you would, please.
Chairman Grassley, thank you very much. Members of the press report on a daily basis what divides us on Capitol Hill. There's plenty to report. We come here today to tell you about something that unites us, that brings us together, and not without a lot of work. Senator Mike Lee and I introduced this bill originally, what was it, Mike, 3 years ago? An unlikely odd couple politically. We came together believing it was time for criminal justice reform, meaningful reform. There were those who read the bill and instantly took a dislike to it, including our current chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And he said so, publicly. At that point, the issue could have died. But we decided to redouble our efforts, to find common ground within the committee and in the Congress, and particularly in the United States Senate. The legislation that we have before us represents more than 3 years of work on criminal justice reform and months of bipartisan negotiation. We were lucky to have a companion piece of legislation, which is partnered up with us, offered by Senators Cornyn and Whitehouse, that deals with incarceration they'll describe. We think this is the most comprehensive, far-reaching criminal justice reform which Congress has seen for decades. And we believe critically, this bill can pass the United States Senate with both a majority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans supporting it. The United States incarcerates more of its citizens than any other country on earth. We have 5% of the world's population. We have more than 25% of the world's prison population. Mandatory minimum sentences were once seen as a strong deterrent, and we now know, sadly, they have filled the prisons with many people who are not a real danger. In reality, mandatory minimums have often been unfair, fiscally irresponsible, and a threat to public safety. Given tight budgets and overcrowded prison cells, our country must reform these outdated and ineffective laws that cost the American people billions of dollars, and equally, if not more important, tear apart families and brand people for a lifetime. This is the best chance in a generation to reform our federal drug sentencing law. I have been particularly thankful to have had from the beginning the strong support of the ranking Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator Pat Leahy his name is legendary in this circle when it comes to dealing with criminal justice reform. As a former prosecutor and a longtime member of this committee, he understands the issue better than most. And it's an honor to have him standing by my side and joining us in this historic bipartisan effort.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Durbin. And I think we should hearken to what Senator Durbin said about there being a bipartisan vote for this if we bring it up in the Senate. I've been here a long time. Nobody's been a better vote counter than Dick Durbin. And if he says that, I think you can go to the bank with it. And Chairman Grassley mentioned the National District Attorneys Association as one of the supporters of this. Chuck, I was vice president of that association years ago, and actually declined being president to go for the anonymity of the U.S. Senate. But the reason I mention that, I know what a diverse group it is. For those of you who've been prosecutors, the membership of that goes across the political spectrum. And so their support for this legislation tells us a great deal. There will be those who will try to use scare tactics, as they always do in these things. But victims, the Department of Justice, the prosecutors who have to make these decisions, they support it. We, at some point, we have to do something about our mandatory minimums, sentences. We must show real leadership in fixing this mistake. We need to do it. It's one of the most important things we can do. But what we have here is a bill which is a first step. It's a modest one. But I know the tremendous amount of work that Mike Lee and Dick Durbin, Cory Booker, John Cornyn, Sheldon Whitehouse, others who you see up here have done to get this far. And I congratulate Chuck Grassley for joining us on it. Let's keep going. We should we should help those leaving prison become productive members of our communities. We should also pass the bipartisan Second Chance Act authorization. We should look at the hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars we're spending to lock people up, not making anybody safer. Let's start spending it on making people productive members of the community. Let's talk about real law enforcement, not those things that fill bumper stickers. So now, Mr. Chairman, who is?
I think I'm up.
Oh, now speaking of vote counters, we have the deputy leader of the majority, and a former prosecutor and a former judge.
Thanks, Pat. I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues announcing these new additions in terms of co-sponsorships. We're joined by Senator Daines, and he's one of 5 senators who've joined to support this, and we hope that those numbers will continue to grow. We've, when we're talking about criminal justice reform, there's, I see Senator Kirk here, who's also an additional co-sponsor to the bill. When you talk about criminal justice reform, to me, the number 1 issue is public safety. The number 2 issue is public safety. The number 3 issue is public safety. But what we've come to realize is that successful reforms in the states have rehabilitated inmates and prepared them for life in civil society. And of course, these are modeled after successful efforts in conservative states like Texas, Georgia, and North Carolina. And while Texas has always had a reputation for being tough on crime, starting back in 2007, we finally figured out we need to be smart on crime as well. And people who go to prison are eventually going to get out of prison. And the question is, are they better prepared or not prepared at all for life and reentry into civil society? But in Texas, we've seen our state's overall rate of incarceration fall, along with the total crime rate. And we've saved billions of dollars in the process. And by taking these reforms to the rest of the country, which this legislation does, we can change our criminal justice system for the better. Senator Durbin emphasized the sentencing reform that he's worked on with Senator Lee. Senator Whitehouse and I were the original authors of the Corrections Act, which is the prison reform piece. And I originally started thinking about these as 2 separate pieces that we just put together on the same piece of legislation. the fact of it is it's a continuum. You can't address prison reform and successful reentry without actually look at the appropriateness of sentences. One thing we were able to do in this legislation with these changes by which we earned the support of additional senators is we ensured that violent criminals and the hardened and those who have been hardened by a life of crime will stay in prison while addressing the ballooning prison population that too often only perpetuates a life of crime. Sometimes prisons called higher education for criminals, where they just become tougher and tougher and less capable of reentering civil society. Our legislation is designed to provide incentives for people who will accept the help to turn their lives around and to reenter society as responsible citizens. So in addition to the new co-sponsors we picked up, this bill is, as you heard from Senator Grassley, earned the support of the largest organization of prosecutors in America, the National Association of District Attorneys. So I'm pleased to be here and pleased with the new support we've gotten and optimistic about our chances to get this moved.
Mike Lee.
Those who will oppose this bill will undoubtedly do so using the argument that this bill will somehow make us less safe. I couldn't disagree more. We have to remember that if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. Here, making a choice not to reform will make us less safe. Consider the fact that we currently spend about 25% of the Department of Justice's annual budget on the Bureau of Prisons. Consider further that that figure will increase to about 30% by the year 2020. Consider also that this is roughly on par with what we spend on the FBI and the DEA combined. So every single time we enact a new minimum mandatory penalty, every single year that elapses when we don't reform our existing minimum mandatory penalties, insofar as those minimum mandatories are out of whack or out of sync with realities, with legitimate penological interests, with something that will actually make us more safe, then we are making ourselves less safe. People sometimes ask me why I'm a conservative Republican, and yet I support this. I support this not in spite of my status as a conservative Republican, but because of it. I mean, first of all, Republicans, conservative Republicans at that, tend to believe in due process. We tend to believe in protecting the individual from an overbearing government. And nowhere is the due process deprivation more significant. Nowhere is the intrusiveness of an all-powerful federal government more severe than when the federal government locks people up for years, sometimes decades at a time. This also has a very significant human cost, which I think is the most important element of all of it. We have husbands and fathers, sons, nephews, uncles, brothers, who have been locked up for years, sometimes decades at a time, when the circumstances often don't warrant it. The example that I love to tell in connection with this legislation, because it fits so well, is one involving a young man named Weldon Angelos. Weldon Angelos, who was prosecuted for selling 3 dime bag quantities of marijuana, very small user quantities of marijuana over a 72-hour period. Mr. Angelos had a gun on his person at the time. He didn't brandish it, he didn't discharge it, didn't use it, he just had it on his person. But because of the way he was charged, and because of the way our other federal drug laws interact with 18 U.S.C. Section 924C, and because of the way 924C has been interpreted, Mr. Angelos received a minimum mandatory sentence of 55 years in prison. So this young man, in his mid-20s, father of 2 young children, will, absent some change, be in prison until he's about 80 years old for selling 3 dime bag quantities of pot. Now, I don't mean to minimize the severity of his offense. I don't mean to suggest that it was not illegal or that it doesn't present significant public policy problems. But I have yet to meet a single person, male or female, Democrat or Republican, old or young, who thinks that that sentence was correct. In fact, not even the federal district judge who imposed the sentence, District Judge Paul Cassell, himself a former prosecutor, took the rare, unusual, almost unprecedented step of issuing an opinion disagreeing with his own sentence, saying this sentence is unconscionable, it's unreasonable, it's irrational, it makes no sense, and yet my hands are tied. I must impose it because Congress has given me no choice. But this sentence is wrong, and Congress must fix this problem, and Congress alone may fix this problem. That's why we need to fix this problem. Because for every young man like Weldon Angelos, there are many thousands of others who are in a similar position and who have been sentenced under an irrational, arbitrary, excessive sentence. Now, most of us, I dare say perhaps all of us up here, are not going to stand here and say that all minimum mandatory penalties are bad. I don't believe they are. I don't think any of us share that belief. But I think we'd be crazy if we didn't say that at some point between 1 day of incarceration and 99 years of incarceration, you can cross a threshold between a reasonable sentence and an unreasonable one. And unless we are willing as a Congress to reevaluate from time to time the reasonableness of those sentences as we impose them, we're going to create a lot of problems. We will not make the American people more safe. We will make them less safe if we cling arbitrarily and emotionally to those outdated, outmoded, and irrational laws that we intend to reform with this legislation. Thank you.
I think I'm wrapping up before we get to your questions. I first want to thank John Cornyn, who was my co-author on the Return to Society portion of the bill, which has been the constant, steady, forward impulse to getting this done through all the trials and tribulations of the Durbin-Lee effort. I want to congratulate Senators Durbin and Lee on having improved their support to the point where I think we now have an ability for the chairman to go to the majority leader to ask that this get a floor vote with the strong expectation that it will get through cloture and pass. I want to congratulate the ranking member and the chairman for the work they did to hold this package together and to keep breathing life into it, again, through its various tribulations. That was a very good effort of ranking membership and chairmanship by both the ranking member and the chairman. I would close by emphasizing one point, which is that this is a criminal sentencing reform bill. And we hope to stay focused on criminal sentencing and rehabilitation as this bill goes forward. And I'll close by saying that there was a lot that was left on the cutting room floor through all of these efforts, but I think it's still a hell of a good movie, and look forward to being able to take it to the floor and pass it. Thank you.
Direct your questions to a specific senator, please.
And I would note to the members, we do have a markup.
Well, go ahead.
In particular, would you still support the bill if it doesn't contain mens rea language to protect energy firms from being dragged into courts by the Attorney General because they question, say, climate change or
I think I'm going to let you answer.
regulations that effectively would destroy their businesses?
Well, as you know, the so-called mens rea provision has been omitted so far in this legislation because we weren't able to arrive at a consensus on that. But as you also know, a number of senators, including yours truly, support Senator Hatch's efforts and insistence that at some point we have that debate and we have that discussion. And having visited with Chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, it's pretty clear to me that it's going to be in the House bill. So at some point we're going to need to deal with it, and I think that's something we ought to embrace because I do think we've seen the over-criminalization of our regulatory system and strict liability, which used to be reserved for civil, not criminal penalties.
And one of the reasons that it's not in this bill is because senators like myself take exactly the opposing view that this has been a sentencing and prison bill the entire time. If we want to get into relitigating elements of the federal criminal code, then we can have that discussion separately. There are, I'm sure, a great number of elements of the actual criminal code that a variety of senators would have a point of view on. But the idea that to this good effort, we're going to attach an effort that basically gives corporations carte blanche to violate laws that have been set up to protect the public simply because it's hard to prove the state of mind of a corporate defendant, that is asking an awful lot to ride on what is a very good agreement that solves this problem quite well.
Like I said,
So,
no
there you see.
consensus.
Senator either Cornyn or Grassley, I'm wondering if you've had conversations with Senator McConnell, and what's your expectation for timing on when this could come to the floor, and is he giving you a threshold of support that he'd like to see before he brings it to the floor, 70 votes, 75 votes, as opposed to just getting to 60?
I have not had a direct talk with him yet for this reason, that I knew that we had to get more co-sponsors and refine the bill so that that other people would be comfortable with it. And I think it's time for those discussions to start right now.
I would just add that the majority leader is going to look for legislation that enjoys broad bipartisan support, which this bill does, and he's going to look for something that we can actually pass and put on the president's desk, which I believe this bill will meet that definition as well. And then it becomes a question of how do you allocate scarce resources, which is floor time. So those are the sorts of things that we've been preparing to answer when it comes the time to take this to Senator McConnell. I think we're much closer to that point now than we were earlier, and we're going to continue working it, try to grow the support so we can say that with assurance that this is the kind of legislation that can actually be signed into law and be a real accomplishment for the 114th Congress.
Senator, following up on the floor-time question, the fact that we're seeing the issues with the appropriations bills that we're seeing, is that going to have sort of the unexpected benefit that could open up floor time for this bill?
Well, I know Senator McConnell is determined to pass regular appropriation bills and not go to an omnibus appropriation bill. Obviously, we've had a bump in the road on the energy and water bill, but let me just say that if there is floor time that opens up, we want to make sure that we're one of the candidates for consideration.
I think you and I agreed on that a year ago.
Even during this press conference, we're arguing that this bill does not enhance public safety, and Senator Lee, we're still here, but beyond that, like, that wealth management issue involves somebody who was carrying a weapon but didn't brandish it, and some members of your conference believe that such a person, such an offender, should still qualify as a violent offender and not have the option of early release. What do you say to that?
Well, because of the objections we heard from some of our colleagues, we introduced in this amended version of the bill a categorical exclusion of those who have committed a serious crime as defined by federal law at any point in their life. So we've categorically excluded them from consideration. But if you benefit from the reduction in mandatory minimums under this law, it does not entitle you to a get-out-of-jail-free card. All you get under this bill is a hearing in front of the same federal judge who put you in prison in the first place, in front of the same prosecutor who prosecuted you, who can consider all the facts and circumstances and determine whether it is something he ought to grant. So it's up to a federal judge.
And victim notice.
Oh, that's a good point. We also insisted that the victims be notified and be able to participate in the process. So there isn't any guarantee. I guess the only guarantee you have is if you qualify, you get a hearing in front of a federal judge.
You're going to have to adjourn the meeting.
No, I'm through.
I gotta go.
We got to mark up.
We're adjourned. Thank you.